This Sounds Better, an audio engineering podcast for everyone.
And we're back for episode 8.5 of the This Sounds Better podcast with Miles Walker, Jason Kingsland, and myself, Alex Sumay. And we're going to pick it up and start talking about what it takes to be a good mixing engineer and everything that goes into getting a good mix.
I think just like we were talking about with tracking engineers, being prepared, like being prepared for what you want to do as a mix engineer is going to help you get in the space that you need to do to work on that record. And there's like a lot of subcategories of what that can mean for every individual. And I think everybody's approach to mixing is different. It is why mixers tend to have like their own thing that makes them good. While good tracking engineers, you can have some unique things, but a lot of those approaches are very universal. And great tracking engineers, you'll see all of them kind of do the same thing differently. But because mixing is a lot of times a solo sport, you can definitely tailor your own self-preparation and come up with something that works really good for you and your process.
And for me, a lot of that comes down to taking care of myself, being able to look at the music and the client with the best attitude possible, trying to make sure that my ears are fresh, and so that I can go in and that when I go to work on the song, it's the only thing I'm doing. I don't have my head anywhere else, and that I can go work quickly on the song. Because for me, at least, I don't want to get too into the track. I find that, like, if I make a bad mistake in a mix, it's going to happen kind of later into the process, that I've been listening so long that my perspective sucks, or that, you know, I'm second guessing myself or whatever that is. But that really comes down to headspace, not skill, for me personally.
I agree with that. And to that point of like wanting to attack it fresh, that becomes a big part of my process. What I really like to do is have the song that I'm going to mix set up the day before. Now, that can be me or my assistant or however it works, but I basically get a whole night away from the song, haven't listened to it, haven't really thought about it at all, even from a technical standpoint. And then I come in the morning, nothing else has happened in my morning, and it's just like, boom, creative stuff off the rip. I've got a fresh approach, and I'm trying out all these ideas that are very reactionary to the song and are just initial instinct, and I don't have other things floating over me, what's happened in my day, emails I've gotten, you know, so that morning time is really valuable for me to be able to hit the ground running.
So one thing about mentality when approaching a mix that's super important to me is, what does the client want? Because I guess when I started mixing, and this is kind of like a story about how my process has grown, I was like, oh, these people are hiring me because they want my sound added to the song, which might be the case. You know what I mean? But in general, it's just that they trust you not to fuck it up. They're putting their baby in your hands, and it's your turn to kind of like help the song get to where it needs to be, and it's not about me at all. You know, and I had to kind of take a step away personally from the songs I was working on, because I would get so invested in these songs. I'd be like, oh, I'm part of this now, so let me do whatever I need to do to make this song the way that I want it to be. And it would work out X amount of times, and it wouldn't work out so many other times. And I just had to learn how to, like, you know, tailor my personal ego away from it.
I'm curious because, like you said, you came from a tracking background where you were making massive creative decisions, not only to help the performance, but also to actually shape the record. Vocal tones, effects, harmonies, and stuff like that, which is not everybody's tracking experience, but it certainly was yours. And so you went from this place where you were making creative stuff in the room and it was being received really well. Then someone, maybe a different client, hands you a record and you're like, cool, I'm about to do that all over again. And then they're like, why did you do all that stuff? Did you find that to be hard to make that transition? Was that what made it challenging?
I think that's what I thought people wanted, because I was like,
right.
Oh, this is why people started hiring me to mix. It's because I was doing all this stuff. And it wasn't that I was a good mixer. It was that I was doing creative things that they wouldn't have thought and enhancing the songs. And then so slowly I became the guy who was doing like the effects and really going all out and bringing a different sound to like the Atlanta trap scene. to a guy who's learning how to mix and make a song sound better. And, you know, and then somewhere in the middle, there was like a meeting point of the two where I was like, oh, I can be creative here and make sure you ask the question like, hey, do you love the way this sounds right now? You know what I mean? Or do you want me to kind of do my thing? And sometimes somebody will say, do your thing, and they won't mean it. Sometimes they will, but like, it's not my song. That's the most important thing, is it's not my song. You know what I mean? And so like every day I kind of enter the studio and I'm like, I have to sit down and make this person's song from where they have it to where they want it. And how do I get from point A to point B? And I do a lot of like writing down of notes of like, okay, they said that they don't like this, and this about the song. So here's what you change to get that to go away. And then now you have a little bit of liberty to do what you want to make the song to where you need it to be in your head, to where, like, because everybody has their own personal preference. You know what I mean? And you don't want to mix a song that you're not going to want to listen to. It's just from a sonic standpoint. Like, you don't want to mix a song and then it come out and be like, damn, I suck. Like, you do want to do a good job, but sometimes that's not really what the goal of the song is at all.
I actually have a good follow-up question for the both of you guys. Do you ever hit moments where you have what in your estimation is a bit of an impasse? So you can either service what you deem to be the song or the client. Like, will you go to bat for the song in that way?
Kind of like what Alex said, is as you grow as a mixer, you realize that every single time you approach a record, it's a different opportunity to deliver what the client wants. Sometimes it's servicing the song because the song might need a lot of help. Sometimes it's just honoring the things that they really like. So in answer to your question, I definitely have come to points where I'm like, ooh, I feel creatively that the song wants this, but I know this client really well. We've done a lot of records together. I'm a student of the records they've done in the past, and I know what they're saying, and they really want this. To be fair, I will typically honor what the client wants most of the time because it is their record. You know what I mean? If I'm working on my own productions, I get the ability to kind of have that final creative say-so. Now, with that said, if it's a project I took on with like special circumstance of like, listen, yeah, I can do this for you, but like I'm really invested in this too. So like, I'd really like you to get my point of view on it. I'll often make both versions and I'll deliver them both versions. One where I've just honored the producer's wishes and one where I feel like I've made a better decision for the record itself. And I'll plead my case. And that way I know I've given both chances in equal opportunity, but it still goes back to the producer to make the ultimate decision because that's who it should be.
I think if it's a make or break moment, like literally if I can step back and try and be as objective as possible, knowing that I'm a subjective person and care about the song, but if I can objectively say like this moment or this mix or this mix choice will enhance the song in a way that'll push it over like that level of where, okay, this is something, we've done something here. You know what I mean? That's when I'll go to bat for it. And I don't think that it needs to be, like a strenuous conversation at all. Like I always just go in and I'm like, hey guys, like I did this, here's why. And if you don't like it, we could always go away. But this, I think you need to understand why I did it before you say you don't like it. Like sit with it for a day. Because another thing is like, how long have they had this song? You know, right. That song might have been in the works for 1 year, 2 years. I've seen songs in the works. I just mixed a song that I recorded in 2014. You know what I mean? And I had to be like, hey, 2014, Alex, what the fuck were you doing? You know what I mean? And like those kind of situations are like, if like, just look at the date created for the session.
Yeah, totally.
And like, you would know how much leeway you have because if it's been a while, just make it sound better. Like just sonically make it sound better. It's been a while. They're ready. You know what I mean?
Well, and you don't even know what you're up against by the time you're getting into some significant amount of time that's been put into a song or been put into a track or even a couple months. Because like, for all you know, this person who's made the track as the producer or the artist or whoever, the A&R even, like they may have like conceived their kids to this shit. Like they may have gotten on their first date with their wife with this shit, whatever it is. It's now got this whole nostalgia with them, or it's got emotional appeal. So when you're fucking with stuff on a deep level on like older tracks, you can really get in some shit quick because now you're not just like, oh, I made the song sound better or different. Like, no, dog, you're fucking with my child or like with my memory or my wife or whatever.
And I think when it like one thing that goes into my decision of how much I do creatively in a mix is also whether or not I'm on spec for a shootout. If I have to prove why you have to use me, I'm going all out on the, like, I want to make sure that my sound is imparted on the song because there's going to be 3 or 4 other engineers that are just doing a mix. You know what I mean? And
Right.
and I would, instead of having a 25% chance that you like mine better than the other engineers, or, you know, if I'm like feeling cocky, like 26% chance, you know what I mean? I'd like
Right.
to enhance the fact that like, I want to stick out either bad 100% or good 100%. You know what I mean? I don't want to be somewhere in the middle. I'm going to try and stand out.
There's something nice about knowing what your client is looking for. And just like you said, each time that could be something different. If it's a standout spec moment, or if it's we have been living with it for a year and we just need that. All those are things that you can usually garnish from your client if you take the time to talk to them before you start mixing the record. And I think part of the preparedness for me as a mix engineer is to have that conversation before I start in. So that way I know what my like initial strategy is going to be. Is it going to be one where I'm taking a lot of new chances? Is it going to be one where I'm just kind of hooking up what's already there? And that's really important to me, to have that headspace kind of cleared up. I know it can always change, but at least when I start out, to know what my client's looking for from me.
And I think as a mix engineer, when you're starting on, let's say, a whole project, that first mix is always going to be the hardest.
Always.
It's always going to take the most revisions. You're always going to have to go back to it once you're done. You never finish a first mix, get it approved, turn it in, and then finish the rest of the album and not have to go back to the first mix. Almost, unless it's a single and it's already come out. But most of the time when I'm working, like the mix, like what they're looking for evolves based off like they wanted this and now they're more comfortable with you. So you're getting a little bit more leeway and they're like, oh, what if you tried this here? And they're like letting go a little bit. And a lot of times they'll be like, oh, cool. Now the first records kind of sounds old to us.
Yeah.
That's interesting because sometimes when I'm doing a project, it comes to me just as one record, but then they really like what I did. And then they're like, oh, just kidding. We want you to do the rest of the EP. And I'm like, oh, that's great. And then, you know, I do that. And then we get towards the end of the EP and they're like, man, we were really excited about that first one. You know, can we go back to that first one and kind of bring some of those things in? So I've had to go both ways, actually. I've had them be like, we were so pumped on what you did on the first one that we'd like a little bit more of that. So it like you said, it really is just on what the client likes. And if they grow in a different direction with you or back to that original idea, something is going to happen to that first record. It's going to be your cornerstone or it's going to be your reset point, I think.
I think right there is the difference between getting one record, one song, and then getting the album, or getting the album and starting with the single. Because I think that like those are the two differences. Is like they'll be like, oh, this is the most important song. Like I'm working on a handful of albums at once right now, which I would not recommend to anyone. But like in almost every case, that first song has been like, okay, cool. Now we got to go back, and now we got to like make that up to the new standard that we created and the new kind of like texture that the album has.
Well, I think that a lot of that is where you're getting into this is what actually makes you a great mixing engineer who people want to work with, right? So you're talking about a lot of interpersonal skills in what we're just dealing with. You know, I also think that there's some really firm knack on how to work out the sonics of people's musical arrangements. A lot of times that starts into being like the really fundamental crux of a lot of what I'm dealing with, where like maybe someone's made a really thick arrangement, and would bet, I could be wrong, but Miles, you probably get some of this just because some of the stuff you work on tends to have thicker arrangements or have more components to it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Especially electronic music. They're just layering the synths until there's no room to go.
Exactly. Sure. And being able to know how to navigate, like, there's a lot of synthesizers that are like down in that kind of lower middle range of the piano. And then you've got a bass line, you've got a drum line, and then you've got like, you know, maybe a vocal with some harmonies. but there's not actually any like music that's bright, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Like there's nothing
Right,
that's up in range. So now you're really having to do some feats of EQ in order to like make the sounds work in context of the arrangement that they've made. Are you finding
Absolutely.
that that's something that's like a challenge for you in what you're doing?
Certainly, you know, and I mean, I think arrangement and honoring that arrangement, but still giving it the best sonic imprint is something that a mixer needs to think about, you know, and sometimes that's like very client based. Sometimes especially in dance tracks, the synth choices are so signature to that producer that like, how dare you change that synth? That's literally their voice. Like the one that I get a lot is Kygo. You know, when I mixed his first album, that was the sound, like, you know, he was really pushing that tropical house sound and his plucky synths. I mean, like, how dare you ever change any EQ on those? Why would you do that? That's his signature voice.
Right.
So that became a creative thing where I was like, I acknowledge that this is what makes him special and his production stand out. So I'm going to build the record around this. And a lot of that was just the thought process as a mix engineer. So I identified that was really signature, really important. And I was like, this is how I'm going to build my mix. Even if it's somewhere I would personally make a different choice, I'm honoring the artist, I'm honoring the production. And that's what really made for a good mixing process on those.
Well, and I think that what you're describing right there is the difference between like a good and a great mixing engineer, in that you get to know the client, you get to understand which piece of the music is their sacred territory. There's always one thing that they do not want fucked with. And so like whatever shape that comes in, like be it the plucky lead synth on that Kygo record or like some of the stuff I've done, like you just cannot fuck with the guitar sound or whatever it is.
Right.
And that, okay, that's my sacred territory. And I will bend and break everything else in the fucking song, especially if it's stuff where like that's the thickest sound in the record, which means now everything else got to get thinned out. It's still got to feel good, but I've got to take my weight out of other places in order to make that piece of music with that arrangement and those sounds work in this context.
It's crazy because like when you think about mixing as a process and we talk about what's the important part of the song and like what you can't change and what should be the star in a mix. And then you also talk about when you're talking to the client and what's important to them and maintaining the essence of the song, that mixing is literally just compromising. You're just spending the day compromising in every single way possible. It's like, all right, so I got to compromise this second snare sound for the first one, but I still need that these parts of that second snare sound to come through. So I have to cut this part of this first snare out, but I need it to a point that doesn't affect the fundamental parts of that snare. And then I also need the vocal to be just a little bit on top of that and the kick to be just a little bit below that. And then who fucking cares about the pads? You know, at least for me in rap, like it's just they're just there. You know what I mean? They're just there. And then you have to figure out what's just there, what's important. You know, you have to figure out all these things, and it's kind of you're kind of painting. You're kind of, but not like you're not the artist. You're kind of doing a paint by numbers. You know what I mean? And you're choosing the colors, and that's kind of what we're doing here.
I've long said the most powerful tool that a mix engineer has when they're working out a mix is the mute button.
Yep.
You know, often productions come a little too heavy. And I mean, you know, it doesn't always have to be a full stop mute, but the most way you can impact a record is in a subtle EQ change, a subtle compression change. It's take out a part that doesn't need to be there. That's like a bam moment. And sometimes if the producer's willing to trust you on that, you know, they're like, this mix opened up so much. Gosh, what did you do with the EQ? What did you do with this? You're like, I took out that pad that didn't really need to be there. Yep. You know, I hope you don't mind, but like, don't you feel like it gives all your counter melodies like a lot more room to breathe? And if they're being honest, they're like, they don't see it as like, how dare you change my production? They're like, way to hear it the way I really did want to hear it. But sometimes when they're in the production, they're in the weeds and they can't see the forest through the trees, so to speak. You know, they know they're building something, but they don't always know where it's going to go.
And the more you know your client, I think,
absolutely,
the more you can make those kind of decisions. For example, I know if the client is not that confident in themselves, they're going to do more. And it's my job to put, I got one production once that had 4 kick drums or maybe 5, but they were all digital samples. You only need one.
You got one record that way?
Yeah.
Let me show you some multi-tracks.
Yeah. But I just picked my favorite one, deleted everything else, and then went back and gave it all the correct gain staging, and that one kick sounded 20 times louder than it did on the demo. You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, now this one kick is way stronger in the mix because there's not that much going on and there's not that much noise in the song now.
Well, and I think this circles back around to like a very, very, very long arc theme that we have talked about through probably almost every episode is sometimes on a production front, on an engineering front, and on a mixing front, the least amount of moves to get there sometimes genuinely is the best way of fucking doing it.
Oh, yeah,
I don't think sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
Just all the time.
Right.
Whatever gets you there the most efficient way usually sounds the best.
Straightest line between 2 points. That's the path of least resistance. You know what I mean? That's great.
When you have to do the more complex things to get your sound, that's usually because something's wrong.
Yep.
Sure.
You know? And then you're fixing something, which is really what being an engineer is like we're fixing the things. That's when all this knowledge comes into play, is when there's something that needs to be fixed. But when it's a very straightforward situation, usually the answer is always very straightforward. Like you don't have to go in and do all these crazy techniques in a mix when the song already sounds good. It's your job to just kind of like make the song sound great now, instead of just trying to show off that you know a whole bunch of stuff that you saw on YouTube.
You know, often when you're looking at the simplest approach, that's a great way to, you know, honor all the choices that are already there in a record you're trying to mix. But mixers, we are creative people too. Sometimes it's not about that. Sometimes when you're like confident in all of your abilities, you want to try a totally different approach on a record. And I've definitely had people come to me with that too. And it's time to throw out some of those simple, safe choices and do some really aggressive stuff. And that is okay too, as long as you know that's where you want to go with a record.
This is a lot of what I get hired to do, is really bigger picture reshaping a record in mix, which can be really gratifying when you pull it off. And it can be fucking hair pulling when you're in the middle of it and you're trying to figure out where it is you're trying to go with it. And there's so many different ways of doing that in a mix. There's ways of doing it with arrangement. There's ways of doing it with really drastic sound choices or really drastic effects. Because there is a degree with, especially with modern production, especially modern kind of more indie rock kind of productions, that the feel of the sonics is so important. Like, you know, if you were to hear a Wolfpack record, for anyone who knows that band, but hear it just like ignoring like a normal good old fashioned like Nashville 1998, make everything sound nice way, it would be really bad music in a lot of ways. But under the lens where it's got like tons of modulation or tape warble and all these other things that you could do to a song, that it ends up giving you a more legitimate, more personable feel, and it has more integrity that way. Now, I feel like knowing when to apply style choices of sonics to match up with what the production is suggesting, that's really an art form and can really help you develop some repeated clients.
Now, that's obviously kind of a very personal finesse. That's probably not something that people are going to step to early mixers and be like, hey, man, we haven't heard anything you've ever done like that. Why don't you give it a shot? Versus somebody who's worked for a long time in the industry, building up different clients, and like they know to come to you for that specific sound. So what do you think about that? Like, I mean, just for instance, Alex, I know you worked on that sound with Doug, and that's why people started coming to you.
Yeah.
When do you get to talk to them about that?
I think when you have like a thing, you know, like I had like me and Doug, the sound we built was a thing, or and still is a thing. And so people are like, oh, I need that sound. I need to go to Alex, which, you know, isn't really true. It's not that hard to do that sound. It's hard to get it right, and it's hard to do it tastefully a lot of the times, and people kind of overdo it, but it's not impossible. But I think when it comes to like going over the top and doing the effects and doing the crazy, like big changes to the songs, usually that comes in a situation where someone's like, we need you to save this. We need you to we need you, like, the recording engineer didn't do enough, the production needs a lot of help, et cetera, et cetera. We need you to come in and like really fix this. Like a lot of times it comes down to like a bad recording engineer did a really bad rough mix or a really bad tracking, and like everything feels distorted and wrong. And they're like, look, it's not hitting because everything's up against this wall. They don't know that, but it's usually the reason. And everything's up against this wall and being smashed all hell. And you got to come in and really like fix the song. And I will say like all it takes is one time of saving the day and you have a client for life. Like anytime an A&R has been like, to me, Alex, we have one day, you have to do this. Like we need this done today. And it's a crazy fucking session. Can you do it? And I do it. That person is now like, oh, we have a problem, call Alex.
And I think that's a good thing about developing being an all-around good mix engineer, to know when you're taking on a project. Am I doing type A, where I'm coming in, saving the day, changing up everything that's there? Am I going type B, finessing what's there? Am I creating some third middle thing where it's like a combination of the two and they didn't even know they were looking for that yet? I think you have to be able to read your client in all those arenas and see what's best for the record.
Well, and I think that that's something that we're going to see as a overarching theme with everything we're talking about from the previous episode of being what makes a great tracking engineer versus what makes a good mixing engineer. It's being able to make yourself mold into the situation in a way in which you're useful. So if that involves being heavily handed and having tons of creativity in your options, hey, great. If it involves blending the tracks together so that you have just the best presentation of exactly what their vision was, fucking great. But it's you being the most helpful to that client in that moment with that particular song and that project.
And I think when it comes down to it, being a good recording engineer comes with being prepared for the session and having your basics covered. And being a good mixing engineer comes with having everything you've learned up to that point inform every decision you're going to make for that song. Because that's what a good mix engineer is someone who's spent the time on making the music get to where it needs to be and can make these decisions confidently and finish a song in a way where they're like, I did what I needed to do. And so for This Sounds Better, I'm Alex Tumay, and I've been talking with Miles Walker and Jason Kingsland. And thank you for our 2-part episode. And shout out to Reddit Making Hip Hop for all the support today.